Welcome to episode 15. On today's episode, I spoke with Vassili Touline. Vassili is a corporate attorney who also operates several other businesses. He works with clients all over the US and helps them set up safe and structurally sound entities that are well protected from potential liability. We spoke about operating agreements, partnerships, working with family, and even shell companies. Since, we're both Russian. The bottom line is you don't want to get sued, and if you do, you don't want to be left too exposed. Why does any of this matter, and more importantly, why should you listen? Well, I personally never thought I'd ever need a lawyer, but then a series of events happened, and I found myself with a frozen account and in the middle of an ugly partnership dispute. If it wasn't for our operating agreement and some good legal advice, things could have turned out way worse than they actually did. And so, just like a doctor, a lawyer can keep you sane, healthy, and happier than the potential alternative. Join us for good conversation. What's up, man? Been a while.
I know, it's been a while. How's your 2025 going?
Very good. Started a new gig, trying to figure
Okay.
out where to go, and so I figured let's have a lawyer up on here and see if I'm doing all the things correctly.
Well, let's check it out then. So tell me what you're up to now. What's your new gig shortly? Summary. Give me a summary.
Yeah, the elevator pitch is I started producing wall mounts for medals for athletes and competitors, and so it's a consumer product company. Let's call it that.
Mm-hmm. What's on?
I've always been on the B2B side, and this is kind of the first direct to consumer product. So we'll see how it goes.
Okay, so it's like light manufacturing here, right? Are
It's
you
light manufacturing, yep, in the States,
in the States? Okay, so cool. So it's gonna be made in USA.
made in USA.
Okay, that's wonderful, man. I mean, I have like a lot of different metals, scattered around the house. So I think one of those uh, products that you have would be handy. So I
All right,
really look forward to.
I'll ship you a couple. What do you
Yeah.
got? Like, what did you do? What kind of sports?
Well, it's for my kids mostly. Like mine
Okay.
are long gone. Like they're like all over the place, But my kids were doing taekwondo and like gymnastics. So you name it. So I think it comes really handy. So I
Oh,
think
that's
it's a
awesome.
really useful product. I think it's really cool. So great thing, man. I mean, good luck with that. So obviously, from a legal perspective, what did you do? Where did you set up?
Yeah,
In Florida?
so I set it up in Florida. I have an LLC. It's basically,
Okay.
this is kind of my second company,
Okay.
producing
Right.
uh, or a business, not producing things. But I was producing things before, but just not in America. And that
Mm-hmm.
one was set up in Chicago, and I imagine operationally state to state.
Mm-hmm.
Aside from maybe a couple of states, I think we talked about like Delaware, for example.
Yeah.
And
Right.
I know Oregon is another one because like I know
Yeah.
friends who've done car purchases and they've registered them in Oregon to avoid paying taxes. And so it's like
There's
I
some
think
trades. There's Montana going on, for car payments, or like taxes, you name it. There are like all sorts of different things.
correct.
But
And so both of my companies are like the past one we set up an LLC, and
yeah,
then the LLC at some point once we had enough capital turned into an S corp. And right now I'm starting with
hmm
an LLC as well. It's not an S corp yet, but I think
but it's in
that's
Florida, right? It's
it
where
is
you
in
live.
it is in Florida. That's where I live. Correct.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that makes sense. Honestly, it's just like, all those so like different jurisdictions, really need to understand, where your end goal is. A lot of people go to Delaware, as you know it. Like why do they go there? Some people think it's like some kind of tax incentive, but honestly, it's not the like main reason because a lot of companies really don't do business in Delaware, unless they're like a commerce company and also happen to do business in Delaware. A lot of companies, set up and lawyers actually advise, like me, I advise, setting up a company in Delaware. It's just because, Delaware is pretty much has the most advanced, corporate laws that protect the owners, the business owners, board of directors. They have really well settled, precedents for all sorts of different matters. So that's why you see like a lot of big companies in registered in Delaware, just because there are certain like awarded protections, for business owners and shareholders and directors. But that's truly like the main reason, because Delaware is always at the forefront, of corporate law and new developments, and it's always been the case. And a lot of other states, they look at Delaware, what was going on in Delaware courts, and then they just gotta follow suit. So that's really like the main reason. It really had nothing to do with, taxes for the most part.
Interesting, because I know that a lot of like financial institutions set up in Delaware, like all the credit card companies and a lot of
Yeah,
banks are
yeah.
setting up there.
Yeah, it makes sense, for your purposes, like I think Florida makes sense because, like if it's a small business, I would advise, honestly, registering like in a state, where you live and you do business, it kind of makes sense. But if for Delaware, like if you have let's say, I don't know, like you're trying to come up like with an investment company, right? You'll be maybe later on like selling to a private equity firm. So obviously, it's advisable to have your entity like set up in Delaware because a lot of like institutional players they prefer Delaware, to your
Mm,
point, right? And like if they buy into your company, they would prefer like if you already have a Delaware entity. Like it's not the end of the day, obviously. You start like off somewhere and then you grow to a certain level, and somebody forces you to like, do something in Delaware, it could be done. It's just more complicated. So really, man, important, what's your end goal is, what you're trying to do. I think for your purposes, it kind of makes sense, where you are, be local. I mean,
Is
Florida has
there,
a good set of laws.
yeah, is there a kind of a threshold financially that would not require you, but let's say suggest
Hmm.
that you would set up in Delaware or another state, for example? Because again, if you're like I'm starting from scratch again, and last
Yeah.
time I started from scratch, so it's like zero to a few million.
Hmm.
I don't think it matters, but I think if you're starting kind of like a large company with maybe investment or private equity, or you're looking to buy like a bunch of real estate, and you're like starting out kind of with a bunch of money in there, not from scratch. Does that make more sense when you to set up in a different state or no?
Honestly, the answer is depends. It's all factual, right? It really depends on the set of facts and circumstances you're in. Um, I wouldn't say that you're like it's really driven. Like I personally don't think it's driven by the monetary value. You
Mm,
can invest in your company, $100 or a couple $1 million, and you still be. It would make sense, for example, to set up an entity for you in Florida versus Delaware. But
mm-hmm,
again, like real estate, it's really like if you're becoming a real estate holding company and then you're creating like a portfolio that you would like to in 5 years sell to an institutional player, it makes sense maybe to like create like a holding company in Delaware, for example,
mm,
right? And then, your real estate is always going to be like on a local level in a way, right? Because you're buying real estate in, like certain states and it's all, kind of governed by the, local laws, the state laws, for example. So you would still have like a special purpose vehicle underneath that holding company that you may like register in Delaware. But again, it really depends on where you are, where you try to be. Are you trying to like source a lot of investments, from elsewhere? So all those sort of things, come into play, and you kind of try, to evaluate, with your, attorney or your business partners. And also keep in mind, like for example, Delaware has like a what's called like a franchise tax. It's basically you have to pay the state just to for being there.
mm,
So if you really don't do like a ton of, I mean, there are like two sets of tests. It's like revenue sort of driven. What your company makes, or and there are like another one that it just kind of there are a couple formulas that the state kind of makes you like choose which
mm-hmm.
one is good for you. But like you could be paying like anywhere between 400 like to 600 bucks a month just a
A
franchise
month.
tax.
Wow.
Oh, I'm sorry, not a month, a year. I apologize, a
I
year,
was like,
not a month.
that's a good little business they got going.
Yeah, well, they can have a good business going. I mean,
Yeah.
imagine how many companies are registered in Delaware. Like everybody pays even a minimum amount. It's not bad,
Mm-hmm.
for the state. Pretty good uh, revenue generating item, obviously. But those like there'll be some expenses on top of you like incurring some other like business expenses just for being in Delaware. So it really needs to
Mm,
make sense for you, like again, as I said, like mostly it's not really tax driven. It's really where you try to grow your business to, and then would you like to have those protections of Delaware law
mm,
really implemented for you for yourself? Is it convenient really? Again, so it really, there are a lot of different things. That's why you should talk to your, advisors and lawyers, ahead of time. Like in the US, as I always say, when you set up a business, large or small,
Hmm.
uh, you know, basically having an attorney who can just kind of think through certain things ahead of time is important, because it would just, I've seen a lot of different cases when, small business owners come to me, and they didn't think about certain things, when they created the company, and now like they have to kind of solve like a ton of problems that all of a sudden fell on their head. So,
Hmm.
relating to like liabilities, and other things, you as for example, are you the single owner of an LLC?
No, it's me and the wife.
Me and your wife. Oh man, that's tough. I'm just
Well,
kidding.
it's great. It's great. It's
No,
you live and work together. It's a
no,
beautiful
I
thing.
know. I've had the same thing with my wife, so I can imagine. But like, I would assume you're 50-50 partners, right?
We are, yeah.
So, I mean, certainly you have more than one partner. And again, even though she's your wife, she's your partner too, right? So
Correct.
it doesn't mean that, for example, you don't need to kind of, comply with certain like corporate formalities. So do you guys have an operating agreement for your LLC?
So right now we don't, and that's the other thing. So we can move on to operating agreement, but uh, what I found out, running the past company is that even your partner isn't just your partner. There's, and in this case, my wife isn't just my wife. There's like multiple ways to think about it from a legal perspective, right?
Yeah,
There's,
sure.
if she's working in a business and she's an owner, so she's obviously she's my wife, then she's
Yeah.
an equity holder in the company, and
Yes.
then she's a manager, and then she's also an employee. So each of those have their own kind of set of thinking criteria
Yeah.
uh, to go through. And so when you're basically like setting up operations with somebody or somebody you don't know, and they're in an operating agreement or they're on the LLC, and they're working in the business, there's like four things to keep in mind.
Sure. Yeah. No, absolutely. You have to think about a lot of things, up front. I mean, having your, spouse as your partner, even make things, I would say, a little bit more complicated, from a like a relationship perspective. But, it's worked out. But also, like when you're like entering into, partnership with another person, you have to like at the beginning, everybody's, kind of, nice and friendly, and I'm sure, like, and I always hope it's going to stay this way. But things happen, right? So you need to think through a bunch of other things, like, how you run the company, what decisions you make collectively, if you're 50-50. And
That's
again,
a
I
hard
don't want to
place,
make,
actually.
yeah, yeah, exactly. I don't want to make our call, like, or our podcast, too boring, but like if we're like really thinking about like certain risks, in a 50-50 situation, for example, what if you're in a deadlock, right? So you have to like think through like certain mechanisms, and we have that in law, certain mechanisms that would, get you out of that deadlock. One of
Mm-hmm.
them could be, one or the other purchases, the other partner's shares or units. In this case, since it's an LLC, and you part ways, but then, obviously the valuation comes in play. I've seen a lot of cases, where, the partners even had that provision in place, but they were like really bickering and, arguing about the true valuation of a company. Like, how do you value it? If it's a small business, it's hard to value, right? I mean, you can either agree on your own valuation, what you think, or
Mm-hmm.
you may potentially, also have like a mechanism where if you don't agree, it could be like multi-level or multi-layer, process that you kind of work out in the operating agreement. So that's why I'm saying, like I asked you the question, and a lot of companies, a lot of founders don't do or don't have an operating agreement like at the beginning, when they have one or more partners, and it gets really complicated, as the company starts making money, profits being shared, the complexity of running the company, making decisions. So like, you have to
Mm-hmm.
really think through at the beginning. It's going to save a lot of time and trouble later on, if all of a sudden somehow like things, may not go as smooth as at the beginning. So, and that's why I say, corporate formalities are very important from the operational perspective, from inheritance perspective. What if somebody dies? What happens,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, the spouse or children of that, partner, come in and start running the business. or would you have an option to, buy them out, for
Buyout,
example,
right?
right? And it's going to be a mandatory provision. So like no matter what, they will have to sell. Yes, they're the owners, but they will have to sell, according to the market value of those, units and or shares. So those things in liability perspective, right? It's a liability is a big deal here in this country. So a lot of single member owners or LLCs think they don't need to do the formality. Do you understand like the concept of like corporate formalities and piercing the corporate veil? Do you know what it is?
No, if you want to kind of walk through that.
Okay, I'll bore you with more details. So for
No, it's
example,
great.
like
It's great.
for example, like a lot of people think it's like, well, I have an like, why did you create an LLC? Well, I created an LLC because it's going to protect me from liabilities. Running a company, something happens, they sue the LLC, and like I'm protected. I'm not going to pay anything from my personal level. So the concept, the general concept of an LLC, because again, it's sort of like the the LLC concept, the company concept has been maturing, for like past decades, right? Because it's a pass-through entity in a way, that you as an owner, you kind of have a company, limited liability company, but like from a like tax perspective, for example, in most cases it's a pass-through entity. It like goes really up to you, to the main beneficiaries, and then you pay taxes. But from a liability perspective, it afforded the same protections as if you're have like a corporation, right? So people love that. It's a simpler structure, and simpler tax, liabilities and stuff like that. So for a lot of people, it made complete sense, and still does. But the important piece of it is our corporate formalities. What I mean by that is that you really need to have, if something happens, somebody sues you, and you're a single member LLC, the attorneys on the other side would try to argue that you were operating, that LLC is an alter ego of yourself, for example,
Mm.
meaning like even though you had an LLC, but you were not, observing the corporate formalities. Those would start with, an
Operating agreement,
operating
things like,
agreement,
yeah.
even though it's a single member. You should have like a very simple operating agreement where you would, have it. Sometimes, like banks still request you like show an operating agreement, if you're even a single member LLC to open up an account.
Hmm.
So then, certain major decisions of a company, you can still make it on your own, but you would be, in a role of a member, or an executive, if so happen to be an executive of the company. So, and you kind of register that, and you have everything kind of recorded. So it shows that you are still observing those corporate formalities, even though you are the only member of that
Hmm.
LLC. So the attorney on the other side won't have an excuse to pierce, as they call it, a corporate veil, meaning like go after your own assets somehow, because we'll start arguing. The other thing is that's I see a lot of kind of issues with the commingling of funds, as we call it, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
So meaning like you
Personal expenses,
yeah, exactly. So you'd rather have your business account, and a lot of people do, but then from a business account they start like funding their own like personal expenses.
Rolexes, and the
Well, you
Mercedes. I
can,
got
yeah, yeah,
it.
but no, but look, I mean, Rolex and Mercedes, you can technically write off potentially, as a business expense. There are ways to do it. I'm not like a tax expert or a tax attorney, but you can do that. You can buy a company, a Mercedes, and write off. Take like Section 179, for example, a write off. It's a lot of people know
Right.
that. So you can do that. It could be registered to your business, but we're still talking about like different things that when you start when somebody else starts probing you and like try to find a way to pierce that corporate veil, so they can go not only after the assets of your company but after your personal assets.
Right.
That's where those things like don't commingle funds, don't use your business account for some like really stupid personal expenses that are not
Vacations. Right.
justifiable.
Family vacations. Right.
Yeah, family vacations, maybe. I mean, again, trips are permitted, under business expense, but you still need to kind of make sure that you don't you keep the right balance, basically, right? Especially when
Right.
you're like a small business, like you, for example, right? You got to find the balance.
Yeah.
So, and that's why, I say even if you're a single member LLC, to have those corporate formalities, like maybe like a not an annual meeting, but like let's say you make certain decisions, you can do like unanimous written consent, for example, boom, and you're a single member, you like major decisions are made, that's registered, and you have everything like on file.
Documented, right?
Yeah, because after you get sued, for example, it's going to be too late to kind of come up with all these set of documents. It's not going to be really cool. So yeah, so those things are important. So that's why, and again, in your case, with having a spouse as your partner, there are like other like potential host of considerations that you need to keep in mind, but it's cool, you just kind of need to go through the process.
Yeah, it's definitely a pit because there's a ton of things to think about. I mean, the way I like to think
Yeah,
about it, and it's really the same way you think about anything. It's all risk assessment, right? It's
yeah,
kind of like it's basically money and time in versus money and time out. And time is a more valuable asset than money, but at the very basic, money is a good determinant for success and failure, right?
yeah.
In
Well, I mean,
especially in the business
yeah,
setting, and so it's
yeah.
like, how do you assess the risk essentially of putting the money up front and then having the potential upside of that money being put in where you don't have to spend it later 10x, which is exactly where the lawyers come in then, because then they kind of walk you through the all the potential holes that you don't see as an individual with limited experience, that you need to pay attention now, and they would be cheaper than paying attention to them later.
Well, 100%. And I've seen these cases. I'm guilty as charged. Because I run my own businesses. I have several investment businesses, and sometimes when being a lawyer, I honestly, of course, I think about these things, but sometimes, things are happening so fast, and with some of my close partners, I may not even have an operating agreement like right from the beginning.
Right.
So,
It's all handshake deals. A lot of it is handshake deals because like as business people, um, speed is more important than quality. And so a lot of times you
yeah,
essentially double down on the speed side, and you kind of let the quality. By quality I mean like the legality,
yes.
the process, the systems, kind of get behind the speed, because first to market wins. It's not the one that has the best operating agreement wins, it's the first to market guy wins. And so it's
Right,
like
exactly.
you're ultimately balancing the safety with the risk of speed.
That's true. And again, when I said that, like there were instances when we had certain things done and then we put together an operating agreement, but those were in my case with very close, partners that I've dealt before, honestly.
Right.
I felt good about it, because, obviously, like we needed to, like, for example, in that specific instance, I'm just like referring right now, like we needed to get the LLC going first because it was, an investment instrument for us. And we needed, like, there was no time, like, to really think about the operating agreement. But we knew we would agree because we already done business before. We had like past
Right.
history, the history of of working together. So it was a little bit different dynamic. But like, again, when I know it happens all the time because I deal with that. I clean up stuff, post factum, like after everything like happens, or so people do that. To your point, they speed to market. Entrepreneurs they think differently. Those who maybe had multiple businesses and burned themselves a couple of times, they do everything from the beginning. But those who haven't done it and obviously very excited to start a business, they don't think about the formalities. The other thing is, obviously, or nowadays, let's be honest, right? You can subscribe potentially. There are some platforms
Hmm.
which I think, are, pretty decent from a form perspective, where you can like go, choose like pick up the state of, like incorporation, and they'll
Oh, like
spit out like
legal zoom, things like
some
that.
kind of legal Zoom or like a bunch of like platforms. But again, when somebody like when a new client calls me, for example, like as a referral, they're like, well, how much you charge and like how much it's going to be. I try to understand the person's situation, and like people sometimes say, oh man, you have like
So expensive, yeah.
your like your hourly rate is pretty high, and it's like, well, I can like like I was looking like I can download like a package from whatever like LegalZoom, right, in your case, and get those forms done. And I say, yeah, man, I mean, it's a nice option. Go ahead and do it, But I always say, to my clients, current or future, my value is not to be like a form creator, honestly. Like I'm an advisor, man. Like
Hmm.
I'm gonna walk you through the process and make sure like you like there's so many intricate details, in a business or business operations or things you have to think through if you're more than one person setting up a business that LegalZoom, may not work. I mean, yeah, there's some questionnaires. I've seen it. There's AI now, but it's still like I'm an advisor, like first and foremost. I'm not like the guy who is gonna, like just only value is just, creating like a form,
Right.
agreement. It's not the case, man. I advise people. I have experience, in running the business, so I know the pitfalls, and that's why my value comes in. It's really being an advisor, strategic advisor, and help you out not to face those, challenges in the future and think through like different scenarios. So not just download a form. I mean, if you're a single member LLC, to your point, maybe it's worth it's okay just to go and download like a simple form if my price is high enough for you. But like if you really have it like you're trying to set up a more or less complex business with more than one person, more than one partner, I mean, I don't know, it gets tricky over there.
Yeah, no, and it's a great point that you bring up because it's kind of a common thing that systems of thinking that people fall into, and even I'm guilty of it myself. Like for example, my wife and I are
Hmm.
trying to put a will together, and we're talking, and we got a referral from a lawyer, and he's like $2,500, and I'm like, why don't we just fucking go to like ChatGPT and figure that shit out ourselves? You know, like literally, I'm doing it myself, and I've been on the other side of it, where basically people have said, like,
Yeah,
I was trying to consult somebody on like business operations, for example, because I've done a
yeah,
ton of it. And they're like, well, can't they just kind of ask the right questions of AI to figure that out? And I'm like, you can. The problem is context. It's exactly what you're saying. It's the expertise isn't filling out the form or even getting you
yeah,
the legwork of the answer. It's helping you strategically think about all the potential forks in the road that you're going to get to before they actually occur. And so that's
yeah.
that's the magic, and that's what you pay the money for.
No, I agree with you, man. It's absolutely the case. It's ChatGPT is great. I use it myself, for certain like random things. I mean, it's all about prompts. Yes, since we start talking about the ChatGPT, right? Like it needs to like sometimes like I end myself like finding that I need to like do prompt over prompt and like I need to enhance my prompt to come up with the right response, from AI. But there's so many different things, involved in a complex operations or setting up a business or legal considerations. As of right now, I think it's even though it could generate like certain like really quick responses and certain like questions and matters, it's still, I feel personally, not there. Like if you really want to kind of advise your client on certain things, it's a conversation, man. Like I need to understand what you're doing, what your partners are trying to do, and how you guys trying to set up your company, how you're going to run your company, and this is all goes into considerations, of what are you going to write down, in your operating agreement or shareholder agreement. I mean, you name it. So, but
Yeah.
corporate formalities, keep in mind. I mean, it's certainly for everybody who listens to us. Corporate formalities for even single member LLC are important. Not less important as if you're like having multiple partners in the business, because again, if anything happens, if anybody sues you, the person on the other side will be trying to pierce the corporate veil and and just kind of demonstrate that you were not observing corporate formalities, therefore they can go after your personal assets, and you certainly don't want to be in that case, right? So you don't want to lose a house because you were like lazy or not diligent about running your own business. So
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And so to kind of tie it all together, the reason you don't operate a business without registering a business is because of legal liability. Obviously, what you want to do is separate your
yeah,
personal self and your personal assets, your house, your car,
yeah.
your bank account, from the liability of something happening where your business now has to close, and you are not in a forced position to file bankruptcy now to protect the assets, which is what the LLC is for, essentially, right?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, you're trying like LLC's purpose is certainly And then, when you mature in your business, you get more partners in, like things get a little bit more complicated from the operating perspective, right? Again, as we discussed, those things need to be taken care of, and like, how you buy shares from another or units.
Hmm.
What happens with if somebody dies, well, what if there is an offer to, purchase a business, right? One partner wants to sell, the other partner doesn't want to sell. So how you resolve that issue, right? So what do you do? So there are
Hmm.
all those mechanisms that are like, kind of come into play if you think through, all these aspects, ahead of time.
Yeah, for sure. And what even with all the legal protection of a corporation or an LLC,
Hmm.
it's still tied to your person, because
Yeah,
especially in situations where you have multiple partners, it's exactly like you said. What if one partner wants to sell and the other one doesn't, and the business is not doing well, and one partner has more capital where they can sustain the risk
yeah,
for longer, and the other one is a little more desperate and the family has to
yeah,
eat.
exactly.
And so it's like, yes, you're protected, but it's still sort of, it's got tentacles into your personal life, and then now you're like arguing with your spouse because you both want to sell and the other one doesn't, and like it
Right.
creates problems regardless whether they're legally bound to you or not.
Yeah. Well, that's true, man. I mean, that's exactly what it is. So you have to think through all these things, ideally. But in a normal world, people start thinking about it, in the middle of the road. So it's also doable as long as they start thinking about it, sooner than later. So
Yeah, and so I think if you are forming a company, especially with partners, obviously it's better to put an operational agreement in place initially than once you're $1 million into revenue.
yeah, I
Because
agree.
yeah,
I
yeah,
100% agree. As a business owner and as an attorney, like 100%.
okay,
I would encourage that.
and so then to the operating agreement. You've kind of outlined a couple of things to think about. So
Hmm.
one of them is the equity split, and obviously a 50-50 split. While that may seem fair on the surface, sometimes it's a problem because in case of
Yeah,
a decision, who's the override? And when two people are deadlocked, then what the hell happens?
yeah, that's exactly the point. I mean, I've seen a lot of instances like that, and deals go south, because of the deadlocks. So it's important to think through. How do you manage? What are you gonna do? 50-50.
So that's a good question, because like in a previous business, I was a 60-40, and so it
Yeah,
actually ended up saving me personally through a few issues that I've had there.
yeah.
Because had we been a 50-50, I'd be kind of fucked. But because I was 60-40, especially in the way that operating agreement was written, I had
Hmm.
kind of the right of operations as the majority shareholder. And so that allowed me to make some decisions that I wouldn't have been able to make otherwise had I been a 50-50 or a minority partner, let's say.
Yeah. Well, I mean, with your 50-50, I mean, now you have to think through, like, number one, I mean, like, you kind of need to come to the table and agree on a decision, right? On a major decision.
Right.
Sometimes, I mean, you could be 50-50, and again, you could have 50-50, for example, for like economic distributions, right?
Correct. But then decision
You,
making,
you,
you're not
y-
50-50.
yeah, you could potentially say that, one partner over another, is making decisions on certain like operational matters. It's
Mm-hmm.
also possible because, you can create like different like aspects, you could be 50-50 in a waterfall, for example, like in terms of like, what you're getting from the company's, business, but then on the decision making, you can potentially say, like those who are more active in the business, they would argue
Mm.
is like, hey, I'm just gonna be making those decisions. But then at the end of the day, obviously there are like certain decisions that shareholders need to make unanimously, right? Those relate to like incurring like major debt in most
Mm-hmm.
cases, right? Filing for bankruptcy, mergers, acquisitions, selling of a company, uh,
Purchases of buildings, other things.
well, yeah, real estate, those major like financial and from operational perspective as well. Maybe like accepting new memberships,
Mm-hmm.
not membership, but accepting new members.
Diluting, right.
So you don't want to be diluted. So that's why, like, so there are multiple ways you can potentially, kind of basically meet the expectations of a 50-50 partner, like, or a 50
Mm-hmm.
partner, another 50% partner. If that person is okay to kind of let go of certain like day-to-day operating activities, right? But if not, then you're stuck. You basically need to make sure that you're always on the same page. In a
Right.
business, it's sometimes difficult, right? Like you could be, it could be member, run business, or you could have executives. It
Mm-hmm.
really depends on the complexity of a business, but like assume like you're just, members running the business. Well, if you're 50-50 and it doesn't really split, your responsibilities, you have to be always in agreement. And if you don't agree on something, then you have to kind of make sure you need to sit down and just talk it through.
Mm-hmm.
But in a lot of cases, it's still there are instances, and I've seen so many of them when people cannot agree on certain major decisions, like concern like how the business takes course, like direction is going, maybe from a strategic perspective, maybe from like incurring certain debt perspective. So that what happens? So you need to think about the mechanism as we discussed, right? Like in your situation, same here, right? I mean, despite that she's your wife, I know her really well. She's great, but sometimes you may not, you may not come to a certain, business decision. So you have to, again, it gets a little bit more complicated when you have a family relationship, obviously. But if you don't, it means you need to like think through like, okay, what are you going to do? Sometimes it could be mediation, could be like a third party that's
Mm-hmm.
trying to like make mediation, not in the sense of a court, like it could be like just a third party that will try to kind of help you arrive
A
at to a
business
certain to
psychologist.
sort of like like there could be a third party that you designate, obviously selling the business, right? So one may have an opportunity to purchase from another and vice versa. So, but then again, as we mentioned at the beginning of the call, our podcast, is that you know, the valuation of your shares, especially if it's small business, may be, sometimes tricky. So you need to think through that process as well. It's almost like a separate process, within that larger, process of figuring out what to do in a deadlock, situation. So it gets complicated. So you do need to think through like a lot of mechanisms. Sometimes there are multiple layers within that one small mechanism that you need to kind of think through. So
Yeah,
that's what it is,
for
And
sure.
then inheritance. The other thing is like there are two partners. One unfortunately something happens to him. A relative comes in, and what are you going to do? So you also need to think about that. So most likely that the other person who is not involved in a business, probably would need to sell. But you need to really kind of have that mechanism laid
Outlined.
out.
Right.
Yeah. So
Yeah, there's a lot of points we can kind of expand on. So the first one is, running a business with my wife at this point in my life is actually fairly easy because a lot of our decisions and a lot of our thinking is on the same page because this is our second business in, and we're 20 years into the marriage, and we've I think at this point have already hashed out all of our differences, right?
okay, good. Good to
Um,
hear.
yeah, I mean, at the major level, again, minor level, obviously,
Yeah.
when two people live together, there's minor things happening all the time. But I think from a major perspective,
Yeah.
those shifts are no longer seismic. Let's put it that
I
way.
get you, man. I understand completely. I
Yeah,
I was
yeah,
in the same position. Still am
yeah,
actually.
yeah, yeah,
So
for sure. Because it's
I do
like
have I do have a business with my wife, so I
it's
get
the
it.
you're like an Italian restaurant. It's
Yeah.
basically it's you live and work together. It's like and I don't
No,
know
I
if it's
like it.
all
I mean,
I
like
don't know if it's only
it's
for
been it's been
Italians.
probably not, since we're like not Italians, we still, have
That's right.
certain businesses with, with our spouses. And, in my experience, yeah, it's been a great ride. I personally enjoyed it. And, I actually value my wife. She's smart, and it's actually great to have her as a partner, on multiple ventures that we have. So yeah, I get it. I get it. But I
Yeah,
mean, do you have any concerns about that? I mean, you still have an operating agreement, so obviously,
for sure.
in your case, it's like it's gonna you guys are gonna sit down at the table, have a nice dinner, and hash everything out. So in your case, I get it. If you're with a different partner, as we said, he's not your relative or your spouse, it's gonna be completely different conversation, different considerations, certainly.
Yeah, for sure. To that regard, other than my wife, I don't know if I'd want to have business with relatives. I actually don't like working with relatives because of, you know, the term familiarity breeds contempt is pretty evident. The
Mm.
closer, especially
Yeah,
like the Russian community, it's kind of like anytime you know somebody at like a car dealership, there's always fear that you're gonna come in and you're like, come on, brother, give me the best deal. And he's always gonna say, it's like, fuck, I gotta make some commission too. So you're never in the same so you're never in the same happy place. Like ideally, I
yeah.
like it's weird because like ideally if you have a friend who runs a business and you wanna give him your business,
Yeah,
you always feel obligated to pay him more than what that's worth because he's
yeah.
a friend, right? And on the other side, he always feels weird charging you less because it's like, yes, we're friends, but this is a business. So it's like
You're right.
familiar relationships are generally never a good mix. So like personally, I'm not a fan of familiar relationships other than it's like a spouse or kids, maybe.
Yeah. No, there are a lot of challenges I've seen. Like I personally haven't had those challenges, luckily. And again, like I only my experience same as you. I only had a business with my wife, and in certain ventures that we had together, still do. But I agree with you that that caused like a ton of like you know heartburn, and a ton of other, complications and considerations that you play. Yeah, I agree with you, and especially if you're like that guy that owns, a dealership or is a sales guy. You have like dozens of people coming over to you expecting some kind of really better
Correct.
than an average, deal, right? So, no,
Correct.
I get that.
It's also
Um,
it's also very difficult to come in and sort of enforce your position to a friend because it's like things I would say to like a barista that fucked up my drink at Starbucks, I would never say to a friend, even though it could be justified. Sometimes you have to
yeah,
enforce your position, especially like you're in business. So
yeah.
like in business, you have to think very rationally. It's very difficult to sort of have the familiar relationships affect the net benefit of the result, right? Like I'm after the result, like it's nothing personal, right? However, when it becomes personal, it becomes very difficult to sort of enforce the win, and so I'd rather not play the game.
So I tell you one more thing, like a relationship to the like I don't want to beat the dead horse, like over and over again, but in a situation where you own a business with a spouse, so if you ever like decide to accept like another like investor
Mm-hmm.
or investors into the business, I
Mm-hmm.
tell you one thing, like they're like I've personally seen that those instances before where investors feel very weary in entering into a business where there's a couple that owns it,
Yeah,
because for some reason they have like a perception that, yeah, they look at you as a one, you know, one
single unit,
entity,
but
yeah,
there's two
single
people,
unit,
right?
but there are two people. So like things sometimes go really weird. For example, if there's a third partner and he's looking at you, is like he's thinking, oh, well, like I'm working hard, but these two guys, they're making like more money than me, because they're
There's two
like
of them,
kind of,
right? Two
so
thirds.
they're yeah, so they're thinking like, well, like it's like, well, I'm family and they're like making a killing like versus me, like I'm just myself, but you have to separate, it's sometimes for like, again, I've seen those instances before. I've seen those concerns
Mm-hmm.
before. So, also be mindful, like when you're running your business with your spouse and you're like, getting certain like third parties into the business, sometimes those guys will be looking at you and it may complicate things, just because of those, financial considerations, looking at you and your spouse as one unit versus, two units, where in reality there are two units. There's your wife, there's you as the business person, there's she as the business person, and there's another person. But that's unfortunately not how like a lot of people like really perceive you. So Keep
Yeah,
that in mind too.
absolutely. It's very strange because as soon as sort of in partnerships, right? When you run, even when not with your spouse, anytime you start introducing your relatives into the business, whether that's in the form of investors or in the form of
Yeah.
even employees, like we've had situations where I wanted to bring my wife into the business and because we needed some help on on some, I don't even remember what it was, but I'm like, let's even just give her a part-time job. And
Hmm.
my partner was
Yeah.
like, well, no, I don't want to do that because now I'm starting to
Mm.
feel like there's two of you against me now,
Well,
you
you
know?
see, so you experienced that yourself even.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And same
Okay.
thing,
Well,
and same thing with his wife. Like, I don't think I'd want his wife in the business because I'm like, I do always feel as the minority partner, even though I'm not a minority partner.
well, here we go. So these are also some interesting, kind of points and considerations that, some of our listeners could actually, take away, after the call. So I mean, it's real. I mean, honestly, I've seen that before. So this is something to think about.
For sure. And I think that's something to outline in the operational agreement. Again, like you said, what if one of them dies, or what if something happens, right? Or they're
Well,
unable
these are
or
all
they're
the
unable to
conversations.
operate.
Yeah, I mean, in any business, you should think about those, kind of, life events, as we call it, right? So, you got to really think through them. So, yeah. So, what else
Okay.
is what else do you think would be interesting to know for you, and you think for our, listeners? How can I
Well,
help
yeah. So
to
we we we
answer?
we, we we covered kind of setup of operations. We talked about operating agreements. What else, other than maybe specialties, do kind of general corporate counsels benefit the business? Because I've done patents before and we've hired like patent attorneys, and so, but that's more
Hmm.
specialty. And then
Yeah.
like I've done we've gone through a partnership dispute, so I've hired lawyers that have gone through like buyouts and enforcement of operating agreements, and we had our bank locked for a while due to the partnership
Hmm.
dispute, and so I got the lawyer involved to deal with the bank. um, I mean, where else do lawyers fit, like general counsels, fit in terms of kind of just a general overview of business operations? Because
Yeah.
again, it's like a weird place because it's somebody you should have, but there's not enough work for them to be there full time.
It's a really cool point from like a business perspective. One thing, just before I jump on this kind of topic real quick, I just want to tell you also, like, prior to setting up an entity, I would strongly advise, I always advise actually, to consulting like a tax attorney as well, that I
Mm-hmm.
can, normally bring to the table. The reason I'm saying that is because sometimes people think the LLC is the answer, limited liability company is the answer, but it depends on the certain kind of business events that are going to be happening in the future, or maybe certain number of employees. Sometimes it would make sense to have not an LLC but a corporation, you know,
Mm.
like a C Corp, for example.
What's the difference?
Well, there could be like different like tax ramifications, at the end of the day, even though people like try to avoid the corporation because it has like a dual kind of taxation, like on a dividend level, and on a like level as a shareholder, right? But sometimes it makes sense to have the corporation versus an LLC. It really depends on the set of circumstances, because if you plan on hiring a bunch of people, you may be better off running a corporation, because there are certain like tax benefits, for
Mm.
example,
C
for
corp
you as,
versus S
as a
corp even.
corporate. Yeah, yeah, yeah. C corp, S corp. Yeah, absolutely, yes. And again, since I'm not like in our specialty, everything's specialized, right? So I'm not a tax attorney. I know enough. Obviously, I know I can give like a few points here and there, but like I always ask my clients to really think through these, like kind of think through like few steps ahead, just to kind of before we create a structure, so we don't need to like redo it, like in half a year from now.
Mm-hmm.
We also think about some tax, ramifications, and try truly trying to understand whether LLC is the answer, or maybe a corporation would be a better fit. So it really depends. So
Got it.
then once we have those tax considerations aside, and we'll confirm with a tax attorney, not a CPA, keep in mind, but tax attorney, right? And then we can just kind of move on, and we create the entity, and fill it with an operating agreement. or bylaws and shareholder agreement if it's a corporation. So we'll kind of go from there and all those aspects we've discussed. But again, having an attorney at a speed dial, I always suggest, all my clients who I initially, set up help set up a company, it's also good to have me on a speed dial. So in a lot of instances, like for you, for example, like you're just starting up your own business. You don't really need me after I create a structure for you or help you set up a business, right? But it's important. Like once your business grows, and you kind of start dealing with a lot of counterparties, you may be selling to large, you start having like mid to large accounts that you're selling to.
Sales
It may make
agreements.
sense. So it may make sense to work out that form of a sales agreement with your counsel. Then if somebody else on the other side start kind of negotiating that sales agreement with you, I would rather you not do that, but even though you're smart, I know like a lot of people,
I've done that
they
already. Like
they
we've
can yeah, but I
yeah,
mean there could be instances, trust me, like
yeah.
I've had like a very long career now, and I've seen all sorts of different things. I was in house, where I was negotiating with like I can't I mean, honestly speaking, you can't really negotiate. Like if you're an attorney, like I can't negotiate with you because you're not an attorney, right? So
Hmm.
you gotta have an attorney. But a lot of people still ignore that and they still do it, right? But basically, you once you see that, you have certain amount of work, there's a way, and I provide that service. There's a way for me to be like in essence your outside general counsel. So like once you're like start like building your business, we can work out, for example, and see, okay, well, you know, you at least, call me like a couple times a month, maybe, and I'm dealing like with a couple agreements a month with you. So maybe it's worth, for us to have like some sort of like a short retain instead of an hourly basis. We have like an arrangement where I start paying you, or you start paying me. I'm sorry.
It'd be great. It'd be great if
I
you
can
start
start.
paying me.
I can start paying you, man, like for your product, but you start paying me for my services, right? So I don't know, but there is in essence, like almost like a general counsel as a service, situation. A lot
Yeah.
of attorneys, do that. It makes more sense because you don't want to like charge them like $500 an hour every time, but you sort of like it's a kind of win-win. You have a retainer. You don't feel. I always try honestly, like with my clients, who I serve, and like my clients right now, because I also run other investment businesses, if you know it, right? So I
Hmm.
only have like a handful of clients. They're like mostly high net worth individuals and family offices for the most part, right?
Hmm.
They're doing like, mergers and acquisitions, buying businesses, selling businesses, like a lot of complex stuff, real estate investments, you name it, and we sometimes work together in certain investment opportunities. But I try make sure that a client doesn't feel shy to call me and talk to me and not thinking like, oh my God, like I just spoke to the guy like 15 minutes, he's gonna bill me, like send me a bill. Like I try to avoid that situation. I try to
Hmm.
make sure that, my clients who I work with, they call me without a fear they're gonna get a bill. Because, a lot of small business operators, they're like, and I hear that all the time, like, oh my God, like I just had like a call with the dude for 10 minutes. He sent me a bill. I was like, yeah, I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
a lot of lawyers do that. I mean, they send you a bill for 10 minutes. It doesn't matter. It's his time, time is valuable for the lawyer. I mean, think about it. Like you're one of, I don't know, like dozens of clients a day. He talks. If he like doesn't bill you for your like 10, 15-minute call, well, it means he worked for free, that day, right?
Yeah.
So it's like, there are considerations, but to your point, they're like, I know I do it, some other of my colleagues do it. We have this service that we try to work it out. So to your point, man, it really depends. You should have your lawyer or a person you trust who is an attorney on a speed dial, and make sure you don't do a lot of important things by yourself, but like try to get them involved. At least
Hmm.
from considerational perspective, or get involved in negotiations. Certainly put together some nice form agreements if you're in a retail or manufacturing business, with retail clients, your vendors.
Yeah.
I mean, you name it. Also sometimes if you're buying services, a lot of these big, sophisticated vendors will give you like a form agreement that you need to kind of,
Right.
sign.
Right.
But sometimes you will sign it and there'll be no room for negotiations. But sometimes it makes sense to take a look and see, if there are any some kind of like red flags in that agreement, maybe you don't want to commit to, So
Yeah. See what you're
so,
signing up for, and yeah, absolutely. And
but I want to tell you, just like the important thing is, there are ways to work out with your attorney
What the
so it's not
engagement
going to
is,
kill, yeah.
right?
So it's not going to kill you as a business owner, as a growing business. It's so like you shouldn't be like I'd like to encourage everybody who like start working with me, like new clients, is like don't think you should be calling me only when you have a problem. Like let's work through like certain things. I think like what you need and try to be available to my clients, and then if it makes sense, if things get busy, then we can work it out, certain like fixed fee arrangements, with if it makes sense. Sometimes it does make sense, sometimes it's a la carte, and I say, hey, I'm just going to do this agreement, it's going to cost you most likely this amount.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it also depends on what kind of business you're running. So a lot of the investment, M&A, obviously, and real estate,
Yeah, it's almost
oh,
more complex and more involved.
they're also all like deal heavy, and so each deal basically
Yeah,
requires its own set of eyes. Like for
yeah,
me, let's say on the product side, there might be a few instances where I would actually need a lawyer, or like operating agreement, maybe it's the
yeah,
original setup.
sure.
And then anytime I would, let's say if I get into Target or something like that, they send me a sales agreement. I'd want to make sure I check that for sell through
Yeah,
periods in case
yeah,
the product sits on the shelf for like six
yeah,
months. Like what happens
yeah,
there,
yep,
or payment terms like they're net 120, and like what the fuck's gonna happen if they don't pay you? What are you gonna go after Target here?
yeah, the
Uh,
120 exactly.
right.
I see those.
I see those too, man. That's crazy. It's like I can't believe people are asking for that shit.
Well, I've seen it even longer. I was like, come on, seriously, guys? Are you kidding me? Even 120 seems to be like a stretch, I mean, to a lot of, small businesses.
Correct. It's like
And
net 120 or 2% discounts. Like, hold on. And then you just negotiated the sales price with me. It's like, what are we talking about here? Like, am I
yeah,
making
well,
any
not
money even?
not to divert, my other business that I have with my partners, it's called Merchant Cash Advance. So we actually work with small businesses, like for the same reasons, like factoring, like factoring. uh, you know, receivables, financing is basically a lot of companies, have those 120, 180 days, of payment, but they need cash, so to kind of operate, right? Pay salaries, do some other things.
Hell yeah.
That's where, our company comes in and, kind of lends, to those businesses. That are pretty much secured by, already like sold, orders.
Sold orders,
It's
right?
called
You
it's
look at the
called factoring.
purchase orders, right?
Yeah, it's basically like factoring, or sometimes people call it like receivables, financing. So, but yeah, it's for that specific reason, man. It's a huge market, for our company that does that, and it's also, unfortunately, like a reality to your point, where you see like a lot of like big companies that are like really pushing those terms like 120, 180 days, payments, which is insane,
It's
but
it's it's crazy, and again, you're back to sort of thinking about
yeah,
all of that through the lens of money in versus money out, or what's the risk assessment? Because
yeah,
there's multiple vehicles to be able to fund that. Obviously, if you have your own money, or if you have $1 million in the bank as a small business, great, but not many do. And so you got to start thinking about, like, do I go to a company like the lending company you're describing that you run, or do you open up a credit line, assuming you can get one? And so it's
yeah,
like that's basically
yeah,
another place where you start talking to a lawyer.
100%, man. I mean, that's it. I mean, that's it.
Yeah.
But anyway,
I
so
mean, the only other question that we didn't really hit on that I wrote down was shell companies, because
mm,
there's another layer of protection in terms of personal liability, and even hiding who the person is behind. A lot of that is shell companies. You always hear, especially we got like two Russian guys talking here, so it's like everybody's like, ah, hold the fuck on, is there
Keep in mind, a Russian guy who is a licensed attorney in the U.S. for
I
a
understand.
very long period of time.
I
I
understand.
don't do shell companies.
I know, and
No, no,
yeah,
but in reality, when you say shell companies, I mean they truly don't exist, really. I mean, it's
it's also a
the ultimate.
name people use for more like trusts rather than a shell company,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Well, the trust is a completely different ballgame, and we need to have like a separate call. And I'm certainly not a trust attorney, but I know enough of trust. I have my own trust, personally, that I don't really use it for now, but it's there, for like inheritance, will purposes, considerations, obviously, as you know it. And but shell companies, again, the ultimate beneficiaries would be known, right? So there are laws right now. the government, it requires everybody to basically every LLC that you own, you have to report to, FinCEN, right? Financial, network, FinCEN, basically, right? To kind of who is the ultimate beneficiaries of that LLC is,
Mm-hmm.
are. So that's number one. So it's like a myth of like trying to like hide under like a certain company is really gone. Even like used to be, if you remember, like everybody was trying to set up a company in British Virgin Islands and the Cayman Islands and you name
Right.
it, right?
Right.
Well, at some point they were blacklisted, right? And they were blacklisted for that specific purpose. Now what? I mean, they disclose every single beneficiary,
Mm-hmm.
and there is no way you can hide from like taxation if this was your like goal, to do that. So they'll basically report to the US.
They'll find you.
They'll find you. Like there's zero chance you're gonna hide. You may kind of set up like a very elaborate trusts and kind of if you're like a really super rich guy, but in reality this is not gonna work really.
And
But
it's
you
not
do
even
create.
it's not even financially worth it, to be honest, as kind of a
It's a,
small
it's a, it's
scale.
a, it's a, it's absolutely not. I mean, like, I mean, the trusts, they do protect you from, kind of, they protect you from certain liabilities. These are the most important considerations. There's some, tax advantages, obviously, in doing certain investments through a trust. But again, it's a very fact specific and driven by a lot of circumstances, by the amount of wealth that you have, and it's costly. It could be if you're using trust not just for basically because of your
Estate.
associated with your estate matters, yeah, but you're like using it with as investment vehicle, then you name it, there are the costs associated. It just needs to make sense, and you depends what kind of trust you choose, but again, I think it's a very complex matter that I'm not even capable of truly like covering, because again, I don't specialize in trust and estates. I just know enough. But SPVs, for example, special purpose vehicles, they're not
Mm-hmm.
shells truly, but I would say I wouldn't call it a shell though, but I would call it like, let's say you have a holding company, right? And
Mm-hmm.
say your investment vehicle, right? But then you start investing into multiple, real estate investment projects. I would highly encourage create a special purpose vehicle, as we call it, an LLC that would own that specific real estate, just so
Mm.
you kind of isolate yourself from the problems of that asset if anything happens. So even if you have your company, which is your investment company, and you invest in various, LLCs, I mean, real estate,
Mm-hmm.
projects, each real estate project should have a separate LLC. This
I
is like a
understand.
strong recommendation. But it wouldn't be a shell, honestly.
It'd be
It
like
could
a
be
holding
passed through.
company.
Well, a holding company for that real estate, so you have like another entity above it, which is your own investment vehicle, for example, or your partner's investment vehicle. But then
Mm-hmm.
you create uh, each LLC for each real estate project, for example, right?
Yeah. So it's a slightly more complicated structure where you could be the owner of the holding company of the main
Yeah.
LLC, and each
Yes.
construction project could be you and a bunch of partners.
That could be it. Yeah, that's also very possible. So, you could have like a company that does development, like a development company, right? For example,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
for each project, you have this LLC, set up. It will have its own, checking account, business account, business checking account,
Mm-hmm.
and it's going to be like this. But but or you can have your own investment company, and then each LLC, will have you and some other partners or investors that come in. So
Mm-hmm.
that's
Understand.
how it is, man.
Okay. One last question I always ask everybody is, you got a book you can recommend?
Oh man. Dude, this is like, I'm so ashamed to say that I don't have any books to recommend other than, professional books. Like really, because I was just thinking about that topic that I completely have not read for pleasure for like many, many years, like at least 5 years.
Oh,
I
wow.
mean, I'm not joking. It was always, like real estate driven, investment driven, like all those, kind of professional, legal documents. And I haven't really read any cool book in I don't know, like maybe not 5 years, but like in quite a few years, man. So I don't have that, unfortunately, recommendation. But I would welcome. a gesture from you to
Yeah,
recommend me to read something, because yeah, I've
I'll
been
give
just
you
busy with a lot of stuff.
I'll give you one.
Profession.
So I generally read nonfiction. I've tried reading fiction. There's only like one series I like, but I'll give you a nonfiction book that I thought was pretty good because
Yeah, give it to me.
it's
Like I think.
it's pretty in line with kind of how I think, and I've always been a product guy. I like product and I like
Hmm.
operations, and
Hmm.
um, the book that I read recently was by a guy named Tony Fadell, and the
Hmm.
name of it is Build.
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 Okay.
Yeah, I think it's
Okay.
from here. Let me look it up. It's from 2022. I thought it was excellent. So he's the guy that invented and built and then sold to Google Nest, the thermostat.
Mm.
So he's one of the original
Yeah.
guys from there. I think he worked for Apple for a while, and
Yeah.
then he worked for a bunch of other startups, and then he started Nest with, I think, a bunch of partners.
That's really cool. I I was I read a lot, obviously, in my profession I do read a lot. That's what I said. Like I read a lot. I read all different things, different like articles, different you know um articles on a professional level, on a business level, but like a book, I think the last book that I read was about the Schwartzman, like Blackstone, the Barbarians at the Gate, or Enemies,
And yeah, I know which
Barbarians
one
at,
you're talking about.
so
Enemy at the
it was
Gate.
yeah, it was a really cool book about the Blackstone,
Uh huh.
how it was created, and also the KKR and all sorts of other things. So it was a really interesting book. I was fascinated, how the M&A stuff and leverage buyouts were, kind of happening back in the 80s. That was a really cool book. I remember that book. It was probably one of my last books that I read quite recently.
Okay. Well, we'll put that in the
So
show notes.
yeah, exactly, exactly. But again, I do need to brush up on some, on some books, and start reading them more. Aside from, and of course, being from a Russian background, I really feel like I want to reread the Russian classics. Certain books from that period where we studied in school, but not necessarily kind of lived the life through. And now
Hmm.
you're reading you know, um, those pieces, and already being where you are in your life, it's just completely different perception. So I really would like to do that. That's on my list.
Yeah, that's great. They say that you should read the same book multiple times because at every time you read it, you're in a different state of mind, and so you pick up things that you wouldn't have picked up before. So it's like
I cannot agree more with that. I've done it before, and it really works. I mean, 100%. I
yeah.
agree with that statement.
Sometimes when you read or listen, like I listen to books a lot, and half the time my mind is wandering as I'm listening to them. But then the second
Oh,
time I listen to them, like I pick up on the things that I kind of spaced out
mm-hmm.
about.
Yeah, yeah, yep.
Cool, man. It was great
All
conversation. I
right.
appreciate all the
Same
insight.
here. Oh, absolutely.
Hopefully the listeners will find this useful. Get a
I hope
lawyer.
so too.
Talk to a
Yeah,
lawyer.
talk to a lawyer. Definitely talk to a lawyer, especially if you're setting up a business. It's always a good thing. A lot of good lawyers are not going to really, charge you for just a conversation, initial conversations, and just I'm always happy to help whoever like talks to me. So
Awesome. Hopefully I can send some people your way. And and,
okay,
and, and
thanks.
and hopefully for a good reason, not that they're, in
Yeah,
financial
exactly.
dire
Not to
straits.
solve problems, right? There we
Correct.
go. That's the
Awesome, man.
goal.
Thanks again.
All right, man. Well, good talking to you. Have a good one.
See you around.
All right, bye.